All right, thanks for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here, and welcome to the program. My guest is Mary Grabar. She's the author of Debunking FDR, The Man and the Myths. She's a resident fellow at the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. She's the founder of the Dissident Professors Education Project. She taught at the college level for 20 years, most recently at Emory University. Her work has been published by The Federalist, Town Hall, Front Page Magazine, City Journal, American Greatness, and Academic Questions. Thank you so much for joining me today, Mary.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure.
You know, this your book about FDR is very timely right now, as President Trump has literally launched, I think, what is a revolutionary administration that's going to affect the future of our country in the coming many decades, if not the coming centuries, in a way similar to the way FDR had that same influence when he took office in 1933. So it's important to understand what he established, which in a sense parallels exactly what President Trump is trying to undo and recreate something new. So let's talk a little bit about FDR and his background and how that does not necessarily match up with the standard official history version that we're all taught in school.
Yeah, there are a lot of myths about Roosevelt, and you're correct. As a matter of fact, President Trump came out and said that they were going to shatter Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal coalition, and looks like that's what they're doing. Excuse me, but yeah, there are a lot of these myths about Franklin Roosevelt that even conservative authors say that if his New Deal policies didn't work, he really meant well,
Mhm.
which I found out was not the truth, or that these were intended to just get us out of the depression. All the New Deal programs, the agricultural program, the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, the TVA, all the alphabet agencies. And I found out, by researching and focusing mostly on his pre-presidential years, that was not the case. The plan all along for Franklin Roosevelt was to establish this deep administrative state. And he made those aims pretty clear as a young state senator from New York when he gave a talk in Troy, New York in March of 1912, where he gave a little history lesson. He was not a good student at Harvard, but he
Mhm.
nonetheless felt himself capable of providing a history lesson at the People's Forum in Troy, New York, and said, while the founders were successful in establishing independence, but what they were really sort of groping towards was interdependence.
Mhm.
And that is the real aim of this country. And, what if that requires compulsion? Well, the government knows best. And, as an assistant secretary of labor, he wanted, mandatory military training, universal military training. He wanted, you know, compulsory labor. He really liked what the New Deal stood for.
Right. And I think that also, don't forget that particular year. And of course, his uncle Teddy Roosevelt had been president. So he obviously, had ambitions as a young man. He became a part of the Wilson administration. Woodrow Wilson, that was a revolutionary administration in and of itself. It was the
Mhm.
first self-described socialist in the White House, who really changed the way we see ourselves in many ways. And in the case of Roosevelt, I think he became the Assistant Secretary of the Navy,
Right.
and he was a real war hawk, much more so than anyone else, when the United States really did not necessarily need to intervene and get involved in that particular foreign war, to the point where I think that the Secretary of the Navy, and his name escapes me, Josephus something.
Josephus Daniels.
Thank you, Josephus Daniels.
Hmm.
He was out of town on a day when information came into the office indicating that there had been an incident with the German U-boats, and Roosevelt took the opportunity to embellish and fabricate and exaggerate this incident as a way to push the United States into war. Uh, did you come across that?
Yeah, I mean there were instances, where he defied what his boss Josephus Daniels wanted said, and even the president, and you know, sort of hyped up the threat of the Germans. The incident in Mexico. He also implied that he was in charge of sending warships down there, telling reporters that there was going to be a war when, Wilson is, having talks and trying to avoid war. There was something about him, and I think I used the phrase, he had a lust for war. He, of course, he never served, he never trained to serve, but he just seemed to like the thought of war. It is a very interesting psychological element of his personality.
Well, he happened to live in a townhouse in Manhattan that was next door to the Council on Foreign Relations, which was a think tank that was promoting international war at that time, and that was a counterpart to the British Royal Institute of International Affairs, or Chatham House, which were kind of working together to try to embroil the United States into this kind of Anglo-American internationalism. So I think that was his orientation. He was truly maybe the first internationalist. And yet, when he ran for president, he ran as a nationalist, and he ran as more conservative than Herbert Hoover. My understanding is in that he actually was criticizing Hoover's government expansion at the time where he was trying to deal with the Depression and the stock market crash. And when he became president, and I think to his credit, we should note that one of his first acts, in a way similar to Trump, was that he ordered all executive cabinet offices and agencies to cut their budget by 5%, to freeze all salaries, and to put a halt on all hiring, under the understanding that if the rest of the country is dealing with a depression, why should our public sector be high on the hog?
Well, yes, he did cut $100 million from the salaries of federal workers. He also cut $400 million from the veterans. Okay, so you know where his priorities are. And you're right, it was a bait and switch campaign because, there was no end to how much money he was willing to spend and wanted to spend. And actually, one of his advisors, Bernard Baruch, was the one who gave him the figure of cutting $400 million for veterans and $100 million for federal workers. So Bernard Baruch was the largest contributor to his 1932 presidential campaign. He had final say over his campaign speeches, and he was the one who told FDR to do that, and he did. He once he established himself, and I think he had other sources of funding as well. He did not take orders from Baruch, but it's interesting how that came about, and it's also interesting in light of the fact that Roosevelt was presenting himself as a friend of the working man, of the common man, the forgotten man, right?
Right, all that rhetoric, yeah.
Yeah. But here he is with a Wall Street speculator, one of the richest men in the country, right? And doing his bidding. in exchange for his financial support.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the myths that I'm busting in my book, is the idea that he really that he was a traitor to his class. That's the title of H.W. Brands's book, and it's a phrase that was coined by Arthur Schlesinger.
Right. Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, that gets into like in the Kennedy Johnson time. But Bernard Baruch also was one of the major figures during the Wilson war
Yes.
years, where basically the Constitution was suspended,
Yes.
and we had an outright authoritarian regime that was engaging in open censorship, putting people in prison for speaking out, including Eugene V. Debs, the socialist candidate for president, and anyone who was a dissenter from the war. And that FDR also, and this is something that you could tell me if I'm really going out on a tin hat here and speculating, but when he gave his initial speeches, he talked about a national emergency and the need to have extraordinary powers in the presidency to deal with it, the national emergency being the Depression. And that in his inaugural address in 1934, he basically and fairly explicitly said that he would be declaring a national emergency, and that a few weeks into his administration, he declared what's called the bank holiday, where all banks were closed. And, there was a lot of fear in the country at that time. I mean, there was then some banks were liquidated and others were allowed to open limited. I don't know if people lost money. I recently read some letters written by my late grandmother, who was around at that time and who was a teenager, and she kept a diary, and she was like, everybody was frightened. Everybody was like, what's going on here? It's like the country is moving to a dictatorship.
Really?
We should note that at that time, Hitler had declared a suspension of the German Constitution after the Reichstag fire. And of course, you had Mussolini had already taken emergency powers in Italy, and you had Stalin, and you had others around the world where you had this kind of massive move toward a strong, hyper-nationalist entities. And I think that FDR was cut of that cloth in the American context. It wasn't like Germany or Italy, but I think that he saw himself in that vein, but he was restrained by our way of life. I mean, he couldn't get away with that here.
Well, yes, he was restrained by the Constitution. The other two branches of government, even though he tried to fight those. But it's interesting, about your grandmother's diary, because when you read most of the history books about, Franklin Roosevelt, what you read are excerpts from letters who are people who are thanking him, willing to do anything. And when you're talking about the banking holiday, now the banks, in New York State, the banks were okay. Governor Lehman, who was the lieutenant governor under Franklin Roosevelt, was governor then. He did not want to close the banks. And Lehman, unlike FDR, knew about economics. He was a finance guy. But nonetheless, all the banks were closed, even the ones that were good. Right?
Sure.
And also, along with that so-called bank holiday, nice nice way to put it, right? People were ordered to give up their gold.
Right.
There were lines. If you read the New York Times, it's so revealing. People were in fear. They're given like 2 days notice and told you need to hand in your gold by Thursday. Otherwise, you will face a $10,000 fine and 10 years in prison.
Oh, boy.
People were emptying out their, safe deposit boxes and banks. They were going through their jewelry boxes, like if they'd gotten gold coins as a Christmas present, they were bringing them in and waiting in line, and there were guards there. And I mean, that's what Lenin did, after the revolution, right? They took over the banks, and there was really no constitutional reason for FDR to do that. But what he did, he was very tricky. He went back. He recalled from his Assistant Secretary of the Navy days that there was a Trading with the Enemies Act that was instituted, and that prohibited the outflow of gold, and it gave the national government power over gold. But can you imagine that? I mean, the closest thing I come to imagining is what happened during COVID, when people were afraid of the government, and they did things that they would not normally do, wear masks, walk one way down the grocery store aisle.
Right. And it was all done under this hysteria that there was this disease that was, I mean, the original propaganda coming out of that was horrible. I mean, everybody was scared. I was scared. I mean, people that showed a young man dying with limbs falling off, I remember reading. And so, they created a hysteria. I think in the case of FDR, that hysteria was the Depression. I think I recall reading an article about the gold, seizing the gold, where he's sitting in his bed with a couple of advisors standing by, tinkering onto how much to value the gold. And it was valued in a way, obviously, that benefited the government. And so people got only a percentage of the value they were forced to accept in the form of basically fiat dollars. And so that led to in a way, somewhat of an economic contraction.
Yeah, exactly. Henry Morgenthau, I think he became Secretary of Treasury eventually, but his wealthy neighbor over in Hyde Park, was shocked because Roosevelt personally was determining the value of gold. Yes. And Henry Morgenthau gave him a figure, and Roosevelt's saying, "No, I don't like that. I want $21 and I don't know, something cents." And Henry Morgenthau says, "Why?" He said, "Well, it's 3 times 7, and 7 is a lucky number."
Yeah, and in a way that brings up another issue about Roosevelt, in that I get the sense that he was not quite as bright as people have always portrayed him. He was kind of like rather, a patrician, sort of a hail fellow, well met, didn't kind of a mediocre intellect. But just to touch again on this issue of the emergency, was it not under this guise of this emergency powers, where basically it declared war, it took war powers, but the enemy was the American people? Exactly. That it was under that extraordinary power that he was able to create all of these alphabet agencies, and that this same power has been ever since quietly renewed by Congress every 2 years.
Congress did eventually assert themselves, the conservative Democrats and the Republicans. He tried to purge all the conservative Democrats during the primaries in 1938. But there's this sense that the president is it. He expresses the will of the people. The will of the people goes through him. He assumes to know what the people want and what's good for them. And that banking bill, it was amazing the way it was passed. It was like when Nancy Pelosi said we have to pass
it to find out what's in it.
Right. And Congress, the House passed a rolled up newspaper. It was like at midnight, and it's an emergency session, and they're all, it's overwhelmingly Democratic, and all these congressmen are new. They don't know the ropes yet, and they feel this sense of emergency, and they're passing a rolled up newspaper because it was still being printed. And then, the Senate passed it 38 minutes later.
Right. And it was kind of the beginning of these big, confusing omnibus bills, which they don't have a chance to read them. It's like 1,000 pages. It's like the USA Patriot Act was that, where Biden had one, I think, with the so-called Inflation Reduction, which, of course, is one of these Orwellian names for a bill.
Right.
Also, when FDR met opposition from the Supreme Court, that's when he tried to pack the court, which was the most unpopular thing he ever did. I mean, I think that was opposed by all sides, and it was like a low point in his presidency.
Yeah, he overreached. He was, buoyed by the 1936 election, which he won overwhelmingly. I don't know how many states, went with him. I think it was over 40, and voted for him. And so he thought he had this mandate. And of course, he was going to take as much power as he possibly could until someone stopped him. I mean, that was in his nature. One of the accusations that was leveled at him at the time was that he wanted to be a dictator. And I believe that assessment is accurate. He had no sense of humility, as far as I can tell. He never admitted he made a mistake, and punished people who disagreed with him.
Right.
And, right.
He could be very vindictive toward anybody who defied him, and he was known for that, including Joseph P. Kennedy, ambassador to Great Britain, who was, in a sense, trying to keep the United States out of the war. So my guest is Mary Grabar. The book is Debunking FDR, The Man and the Myth, available at Amazon and at major bookstores. So you had the situation of emergency powers and the alphabet agencies. I think that it's been said, and maybe with some justification, that some of that actually prevented the United States from becoming a communist country, particularly the CCC, which employed tens of thousands of unemployed men doing these massive projects, very much in line with the American project tradition going back to Henry Clay, the Whigs, the nationalist American position. I mean, it goes back to the Erie Canal. And right here in Boston, for example, where I live, the FDR administration, they created the Cape Cod Canal and the bridges over that canal in a matter of 3 years. It's actually amazing when I drive over that bridge to go to the Cape to visit my mother. I'm awestruck by how those bridges were built from 1933 to 1935. Today, those bridges would take 20 years. And he did it with this inexpensive labor of men taken basically off the street who might otherwise have contributed to a revolution.
Yeah. Well, I have mixed feelings about that. If there is any program, among those alphabet agencies that I think were good, I would say it's the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and it basically took young men and gave them work to do, because young men in times of desperation can be very dangerous. I mean, right. And they weren't paid much, but they were paid, and they also got kind of pseudo-military training, which is always needed. He neglected the military up until about 1937 or 38.
Right.
But the other public works projects, the problem with those was that the wages were relatively high, and it excluded a lot of workers. So it was they were artificially high. And if you were lucky enough to get one of those jobs, it was good for you. But I think it distorted the economy. And and he was, and it was very divisive. I mean, he was a divisive president. His first inaugural address is extremely divisive, when he talks about the money changers in the temple and chasing them out, and the speculators, whereas he was doing that himself. But so very hypocritical. But these public works projects, could they have been done privately? I mean, I think the consensus of most economists, other than the Keynesians, is that Hoover began it. Hoover began tinkering, and so when you had the AAA program that was ordering farmers to plow under a third of their crops and to slaughter all the piglets, and they didn't even have the equipment to do that. That was kind of started by Hoover, with good intentions by Hoover. I think personality-wise, he was very different from FDR, the engineer.
Right.
And but I think the consensus of conservative historians, the relatively few who have written about FDR's New Deal, is that he should have left the economy to sort of bottom out. So what they did is they artificially raised wages. So Hoover started doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And also to go back to letting the economy sort of recover on its own. The same thing had happened in 1920 after World War I. There was a depression. Things were pretty much left alone. Wages decreased, prices decreased, but then it kind of found its own level. But what happens when you artificially raise wages? You force business owners to do that. They have to lay off people, and
it has like a unintended consequence. And I mean, the other big project was the TVA, the Tennessee Valley, which I think took some government involvement to pull off such a huge project. And it's one that actually, I think, still remains in place to this day. And then there was the Dust Bowl, that it required government intervention in that surface soil was being blown even up to Washington. It was on Roosevelt's desk. And the other one, of course, is the National Park Service. And a lot of, I think, good construction went into that. If you go to like the Shenandoah Valley Park and other parks, a lot of Depression era work was done. I don't know if it was the CDC or what. But I don't think that's all bad. I think that is, as I say, there is a certain American blueprint tradition that goes back to Henry Clay in that regard. Now, to bring things up to the eve of World War II, there have always been rumors that were actually articulated by Thomas Dewey in the campaign of 1944, that FDR had pre-knowledge of and that he had instigated the attack on Pearl Harbor, in that there was a complete embargo on oil and other products to Japan, which they say might have forced Japan's hand in that. Do you have any research on that?
Yeah, there's no question about it. FDR wanted to get us into war. He wanted to help Great Britain. He also had a lifelong hatred of Germans and the Japanese. There was the Alien, I think it's called the Alien Exclusion Act or something in the 19-teens that prohibited, Japanese nationals from owning land. That led to riots. FDR wrote a column, I think it was in 1923 or 25, where he talked about the Japanese menace in California.
Right.
So yes, the encirclement, sort of cutting off this island nation from all its resources, was provocative. He did, Also, he sent someone in the Navy was going to send him off into the Philippines, knowing that, into Japanese enemy territory, basically on a suicide mission, hoping that the Japanese would attack. Admiral Richardson had told FDR, don't keep the fleet in Hawaii. They're vulnerable, And FDR said, well, I've got an election to win, 1940, and kept the fleet there. And, of course, fired Richardson or moved him to a different position and put Kimmel in his place. Mm-hmm. So did he know exactly on December 7th, on December 6th in the evening that, 3:00 in the morning of December
7th, 1941.
Right. Well, I think I think the telegram came in around 1:00 in the afternoon, and so it was in the early morning hours, the West Coast time. Did he know that it was going to happen exactly then? I don't know, but certainly it was not it could not have been a shock to him. And one of the first things he said, or the first thing he said immediately, is, I'm ruined, or about his own reputation. Forget the 3,000 men who died, right?
Right, exactly. It was a devastating attack. Even if he did know, I'm not sure he knew it was going to be that big an attack.
Right.
It really destroyed the Pacific Fleet, and it was what really was one of the most infamous events in American history, and did nothing like that up until the attack on 9/11 of 2001. Now, FDR's administration was honeycombed with communists. That's something that has been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. Whittaker Chambers, who was one of the handlers of communists inside the FDR administration, including Alger Hiss, of course, Undersecretary of State, Harry Dexter White, Undersecretary of the Treasury, and several other people. Laughlin Curry, who was a chief legal counsel who actually lived in the White House, Harry Hopkins, a bunch of others. He warned the Roosevelt administration, mainly after the Hitler-Stalin Pact, because he could see that, we were heading into real danger at that time. He had a meeting with Adolph Burley, who was a close associate of FDR, and he warned him. And he said, please let the president do something about this. When Burley went in to talk to FDR about it, FDR told him, mind your effing business. And he did nothing. What was going on with that? Did he didn't certainly deny it, and he had these people literally living in the White House. I mean, these were high-level figures who were reporting to Stalin. What was going on with that?
It's very curious. He had this infatuation with Stalin, he wanted the two economic systems to sort of converge. He thought that through his personal charm, he could sort of persuade Stalin not to murder as many people or, send so many to the Gulag. But, the problem began with the recognition of the Soviet Union in 1933. But already But in 1932, he was meeting with Walter Duranty, the New York Times reporter who lied about the starvation of millions in the Ukraine, yes, and talking to him about giving Soviet Russia recognition, diplomatic recognition. And it had been tried by other countries, and they said, we can't do this. As soon as you open up the doors to these people, they send in spies, they sabotage your government. And so Roosevelt had warnings, a couple of journalists, that I think it was only maybe it was in August of that year, 1932, said, we've been there, we've seen what's going on. There is state-sponsored, famine. It's been engineered by Stalin, but FDR didn't care. I mean, like he said, mind your own effing business.
Mm-hmm.
That just shows complete indifference to.
Very amoral individual.
Yes.
Plus,
Yeah.
when his wife Eleanor brought up the lynching of black people in the South, he told her to stay out of it and mind her business. He didn't want to hear about it. Speaking of whom, talk about obsession with Stalin. She wrote "Dear Uncle Joe" as a column during the war. She seemed to have loved Stalin. I wonder if you know anything about her and her rather peculiar relationship with him.
Yeah, I don't know about her relationship with Stalin, but I
No,
do
her
know.
relationship with her husband.
Oh, her husband. Yeah. That was a political marriage. For the as he was growing up, Franklin Roosevelt admired Teddy Roosevelt. As a freshman at
Mhm.
Harvard, he had told this girl and her family that he was going to be president, and this was his goal.
I
And
see.
the path he would follow was the one Teddy Roosevelt had laid out. And she did not want to marry him or have anything to do with him. And he pursued some other girls, but then he came across his distant cousin Eleanor on a train. I think it was, she was about 16, he was 18, and he was with his mother, which was often the case. She was pretty domineering.
Yes.
And they married young, but he all his life he wanted to get in with that other side of the family. There was the Oyster Bay branch on Long Island, which was
Hmm.
Teddy Roosevelt, the Republicans, and then the Hudson River Roosevelts, the Democrats. Franklin's father was a Democrat, and he sought to be connected with that side of the family. And so it was a politically advantageous marriage. So when they were on their honeymoon in Europe, people didn't know who Franklin Roosevelt was, but they knew who Eleanor was. She was, Teddy Roosevelt's niece.
Right.
So, but he had no respect for her. She had grown up as pretty much an orphan after around the age of 10. Her mother, didn't treat her very well. Her father, Elliot Roosevelt, Teddy's brother, was an alcoholic and a drug addict and a womanizer. Though she worshipped him. And so she was kind of shunted around with her two younger brothers between relatives and this kind of stern grandmother. So she came from a sad background and was flattered by the attention of Franklin, who, of course, had an opposite experience in growing up. He was an only child, doted on, treated like a young gentleman, and had everything he ever wanted.
Hmm.
And so I go into some of the things that he did to her, which were pretty cruel. But anyway, while he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he carried on this long-term affair with Lucy Mercer, who was Eleanor's social secretary.
Right.
And Eleanor, and there was talk about it in Washington, so people would like whisper, and she sensed something was going on. But when he came back in I think it was 19 from his European tour of the battlefields, and he had been stricken with pneumonia and influenza. And so she was unpacking for him and came across these letters, and that marriage was destroyed at that point.
Right. Hmm.
And I think
And
it
was already with 5 children.
Yeah, as one of, I think it was James Roosevelt, one of the sons, said, there was always like this kind of warfare going on. They were sort of at a standstill, but you never knew,
Mhm.
there were
Right.
hostilities constantly between the two of them. It was pretty
Plus,
sad.
there were rumors about both of them having extramarital affairs, even during the White House years, and there was rumors of Eleanor having lesbian affairs, of FDR being a homosexual while at Harvard. They seem like, in a way, like the classic elite type people that just led a rather decadent and strange life.
Well, there was the scandal of homosexuality while he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and there was a hearing, but he got out of that, and there were several people who described him as being effeminate, um, and so I don't know.
Right. Okay.
What he did. And certainly, I've been to the FDR library, and Eleanor had built this cottage. I forget what it was called, but if you see the pictures of her friends, they're obviously, they're lesbians, and it was known, these were women living together in relationships.
Plus, it was the love letters with Lorena Hickox
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah,
which were published, I think, in the 80s. But
yeah.
and they just were sort of decadent. It was very heavy drinking and smoking and who knows what else. And the atmosphere was I don't know, a bit debauchered in the hours.
Well, he
Now,
liked his cocktails, yes.
yeah. Now, at the end of FDR's life, um, he contacted Stalin because he had gotten a report that Stalin had held when he moved into Eastern Europe. He had held Americans as POW as prisoners.
Hmm.
And he demanded that Stalin release those prisoners at once. That these were Americans and we were allies. Stalin sent him back a scathing letter saying, "Oh, how dare you preach to me when America? Look how you treated Native Americans in the last century," and this kind of thing. And at that time, also, I don't really exactly recall where I read this, but FDR was contacted by Churchill, who said, "Look, we have been betrayed. We have been had by Stalin at Yalta. Don't forget, at the Yalta conference, Roosevelt had Alger Hiss standing over his shoulder.
Right.
After that conference, Alger Hiss went to Moscow where he received an award. And then he became undersecretary of the first Secretary General of the UN.
Hmm.
But to get back, I mean, Churchill warned him. He said, "Look, Stalin is going to be occupying Poland. He's not going to do anything that not going to keep any commitments, and that we basically have frittered away the victory against Hitler." And FDR became angry about it, and he became suddenly. It's like he became, to use an expression, red pilled. He's like, "I've been had. I thought that I could work with Stalin because of my great personality and charm, and
Hmm.
I'm in big trouble now. And Stalin is screwing this country, and he's occupying Eastern Europe." And he began to start to speak about it. It was shortly after that he died.
Right.
Now, I'm not trying to weave a conspiracy theory here because I'm not saying I know this. No one does. But I kind of wonder, given the fact that the people around him, very close quarters, were pro-Stalin, including his chief lawyer Laughlin Curry and and his wife, frankly. I mean, I kind of wonder if something might have happened. In other words,
Like,
he might have been given. It might have been a hit.
oh, well, I haven't heard that. Franklin Roosevelt had health problems.
Sure. Oh yeah, no question.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because, I mean, even before he ran for his third term, he was having health problems,
Right.
uh,
And
with
they
a
were covering it up. Yeah.
high blood pressure and so forth. And his last year, I mean, it's kind of surprising that he lasted as long as he did. I mean, if you look at pictures from Yalta, I mean,
It looked terrible. It was all gaunt.
yeah,
But at the
yeah,
same time, it was a strenuous trip to go there for a man of his condition and age. And
right,
look, I mean, I think that it probably died of natural causes while visiting Lucy Mercer at Warm Springs, Georgia. But
right.
I mean, I don't, it's just that if what has been said is true in terms of Churchill waking him up and like, we have to take action, we can't let this happen. There was a lot at stake in terms of the Soviet Union expanding into Eastern Europe and making sure that that went according to plan. And there were a lot of people around him in his administration who were pro-Soviet and who wanted to help that happen. It just seems like he might have been vulnerable to
Mm.
something like that. I mean, again, we'll never know. I don't think it's something that it's something we can only speculate about. But what we do know is that Stalin completely screwed over Roosevelt at Yalta. It was a terror, and he was said at the time. But he ended up occupying Eastern Europe as a result, which was the whole point of World War II in the first place, which was Poland was being occupied by Germany and Russia. So,
Yeah. Well, I don't think Roosevelt cared about Eastern Europe.
right,
He, when he made the deal in Tehran, for Poland, he was talking about, well, I've got to tell the Poles in the United States that, they're going to have a democratic government, just, kind of like what Obama did with Medvedev, where he was caught on tape saying, wait, I have
I'm
to wait.
elected. Yeah, right.
Right,
We'll talk to Vladimir afterwards about this. Right.
right. And, and I think, I don't think I'm from an Eastern European country. I was born in Slovenia, so it's kind of
Mhm.
personal with me.
Right.
And, Churchill was a little more aware. I mean, that's why he wanted the Mediterranean campaign, and it was Stalin that was pushing for an attack on the Western Front. And,
Mhm.
anyone could have seen that, that this was, Stalin's goal, because he wanted to come in and take over Eastern Europe. And Churchill recognized that, although, in the end, he settled for Greece and, keeping the Mediterranean open.
Mhm.
And, the Eastern Europeans, I mean, they were just dispensable by the
Right.
Western leaders.
Yeah.
It was just like pieces on a chessboard, just,
The terrible betrayal of the whole principle of World War II. In a sense, Russia was
yes,
left standing after the war. We defeated one side and not the other. The other one expanded, and that led
yeah,
to a horrible period of oppression and Cold War that continued right up to Reagan. Um,
mhm,
so to sort of wrap things up, I want to look at the legacy of FDR in terms of the actual impact that he had on how we governed ourselves after his administration, what sort of changed, and in the context of what is happening right now with President Trump, who is sort of beginning to unravel some of what Trump accurately describes as the deep state that I think was established by FDR and by Truman. Anyway,
well, yeah, I mean, this idea of the brain trust, where you have these, supposedly really smart people, with Ivy League degrees, and they're going to, run these agencies that are going to be another branch of government that's actually going to have control over the other branches and taking power away from the people. through their elected officials. So, we've got this huge administrative state. And you just listen to some of these people who are being fired or, given these compensation packages. And it's like, how dare you, kick me out? Don't you know what I'm doing for you by having, drag shows in, Turkestan or wherever, that's what they need, we know this better than you do. And, just the arrogance of such people. I mean, Joseph Lash, you're talking about communists and Eleanor Roosevelt. He was a very close friend and was part of this front group that was a communist group, and she was just sort of taken in. But even he, in his book, admitted that these bureaucrats, these PhDs who worked in Washington, D.C., were making 2 to 3 times as much as they could make if they were teaching or had other jobs. I mean, and Washington exploded in size. It was a sleepy little town, but under the New Deal, you had all these, self-important people walking around, and that's, and it's only grown since then. And, that's what Washington has become. And I think that was one of the reasons, there's been these proposals for, putting these offices in Wyoming or, someplace else.
President Trump wants to put like the Department of Agriculture in Wyoming, which is brilliant.
Yeah.
Get it out of Washington. Why, it's this huge. It looks like ancient Rome. It's this massive government, and these people seem to have gotten awfully rich. These are public servants. Even like I noticed Samantha Powers, the head of the USAID. How is it that she's worth $18 million?
Oh, is she?
Yeah, apparently. I mean, working for AID, she didn't start out that way. This is true. Trump is saying he's going to investigate this. That Elizabeth Warren likes to talk about. The poor. She's worth, I think, about $10 million. On a teacher's salary. So these people have, besides being so arrogant and so out of touch. I mean, they've just profited immensely. Obama was given a book deal worth $10 million just to start running. I mean, in a way, it's sort of a hand washing the other. This whole rotten establishment where they just sort of help each other up the rat line, and they demonize everyone else, and they have no idea who they are or what they're doing. It's just it really is almost like what Professor Michael Glennon called the double government. He's being a professor he's not some conservative. He's a professor at the Fletcher School, and he's a former counsel to the U.S. Senate. So, I think that's what we're looking at now. They are so out of touch, so top heavy, and so filled with their own sense of importance. And that does reflect Roosevelt's personality. I mean, he almost had like a sense of like, not noblesse oblige, but, like divine right of kings, which is something that we got rid of when we kicked out George III, or the Chinese concept of the, the magic kingdom. I mean, the head of the Chinese dynasty, the mandate of heaven, they called it. Mm-hmm. It's really something that's not the American way. And I think that he set in motion a pattern that has continued up until now, that enough people are waking up. So it's very interesting to study who he was and what he did. I mean, it's not just politics either, or policy. It's personality. It's, you set the stage. The president does this. I mean, George Washington was very aware of that when he became president. He wanted to be careful how he was addressed, how he looked while riding a horse, what kind of suit he wore, how his hair was combed. Because he knew that he was setting a stage that every president following him would imitate to a certain degree, and they have. So FDR had that kind of impact on American politics, not just the presidency, but the entire, bureaucracy that has run the show since. And that's now being smashed, thank God.
Yeah, well, I hope it is smashed, because these people who are in these departments, they change the terminology. They change names. They switch people around. I was in academia, so I know that they're going to try every method that they can think of, behind the walls to keep doing what they've been doing and feeling very righteous about it. But that's what I'm trying to point out in my book is that, FDR thought of himself, or actually Edmund Wilson, the liberal journalist, said that he governed as if he were Lord of the nation. And I think, and that comment struck me. It's in a book called Upstate. And I thought, well, that's exactly right. And John Flynn had this book in 1940 titled Country Squire in the White House. But that view of Roosevelt, which I think is accurate, has been quashed by these historians. These historians in the interim have built up this myth that FDR was an advocate of the working man, of the forgotten man, when in fact he was the opposite. He was an elitist who felt that he was like the country squire who would tell every American, what their job was, where they should live, farmer, where he should plant his crops, what crops he should plant, even though he'd never farmed actually. So, that is who he really was.
It was like a feudal lord.
Yes, exactly.
Controlling the serfs and being very benevolent, but yet everyone had to be, basically subservient. So the book is Debunking FDR, The Man and the Myths. Mary Grabar is the author. The book is available at all major bookstores, at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Mary, what is this project that you're involved in? The dissident, professors. What are you're calling it? The Dissident Professor Education Project.
Yes, well, that was started back in 2011 when I was still teaching at Emory. And I was writing articles, people are aware now about critical race theory and DEI, but no one was really aware of that back then. They knew that professors were liberal, but they had no conception of what was really going on. And so I thought, well, I know what's going on because I'm right in the middle of it and I'm going to expose it. And I was writing articles and I had these adjunct positions, and when a department chair or the college president got wind of these columns, all of a sudden I had no more classes the following semester. So to teach after they'd been begging me. And so I was sending out my articles to a list, and I gotten a check for $500 from one of my readers. And I thought, wow, I'm going to have to really do something with this. So I set up a website, and I thought, well, I'll be a nonprofit so he can get the tax write-off and other people can. And then I got caught up in Obama's IRS.
Uh-oh. Yeah, well, that was the whole Lois Lerner business.
Yes, yes.
Suddenly, all of a sudden, these new conservatives started to wake up and realize that they could do the stuff that was really only meant for liberals in terms of tax exemptions and nonprofit. Yeah, very, very bad news. Mary, so thank you for joining me. This is really a great talk, and I'd love to get in touch with some of the other authors and intellectuals in your group. But let my listeners and viewers know where they can get your excellent book and website or anything else you'd like to share.
Sure. Yes. So my book is, published by Regnery. You can go there. You can go to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, any place books are sold. You should be able to get it there. My website, if you want to see all my articles, I publish frequently. I've been publishing on FDR lately. It's marygrabar.com. Last name is Grabar. Sign up for my newsletter. I send out notices when I have things published or if I'm speaking someplace, and you can go to Dissident Prof,
Okay.
.com.
Wonderful.
And sign up for my newsletter and stay in touch. And that's how
Okay.
you can get in touch with me.
DissidentProf.com. Mary Grabar, again, thanks for joining me today. Really good talk. I really appreciate it.
Yes, it's been fun. Thank you.